Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's roundtable, Practicing What We Preach. And when Megan and I put the conference together, we know that there are a lot of, we knew and know that there are a lot of really interesting ideas out there in academia about how we can face the climate crisis, what it is, the history of it, how we contextualize it, and issues that are going on. But we also wanted to have a discussion about how we in academia could be more responsive to the climate crisis. So the idea behind this roundtable was to have our panelists present their ideas about how we can make our profession and academia in general more responsive to the climate crisis, not as just something that's happening out there or something that we think about and communicate with each other about, but as something that we can contribute to solving. Our panelists, each of our panelists today have done work related to this topic. So it's my pleasure to introduce them. Like yesterday and earlier this morning, each panelist will be introduced before their presentation. And then we'll move on to a discussion between the panelists based on the overlapping themes or divergent ideas they've presented. And then we'll move on to questions from the audience. So if you are an attendee or in the audience, what we hope you will do is raise your hand and then we can enable you to speak, which adds a more human dimension to a Zoom meeting. You can ask your question to the panelists. But if you're not comfortable for that, or if for some reason you can't do that, feel free just to type your question in the question and answer part of Zoom, and Megan and I will moderate and read those questions to the panelists. So our first panelist is someone who has thought a lot about how we as scholars can be more thoughtful and critical about our behavior in the academy. And that is Dr. Andrea Gaynor. Dr. Gaynor is an associate professor of history at the University of Western Australia. As an environmental historian and activist, she seeks to use the contextualizing and narrative power of history to assist transitions to more just and sustainable societies. Her most recent book, co-authored with Richard Broome, Charles Fahey, and Katie Holmes, is Malay Country, Land, People, and History. She has held fellowships with the Rachel Carson Center, the University of Bristol, and National Library of Australia, and is the convener of the Australian and New Zealand Environmental History Network and vice president for the European Society for Environmental History. Her current research includes histories of community-led land management in Western Australia, water in Australian urbanization, and nature in Australian urban modernity. Her presentation today is titled, "We Use the Living Earth to Make Our Histories." So Andrea, the floor is yours.
Much. Cheers. Thanks very much, Erica. And thank you very much to you and Megan and everybody involved, Courtney and everybody, for organising such a terrific conference. It's conventional in Australia to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the land on which we are meeting and working. So I'd like to acknowledge the Minang Noongar people and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the co-authors of the paper that I'm going to be speaking to today, the working paper, which is published online. And I've really benefited from the conversations and the work that I've had with these people. So that's Carla Pascoe-Lay, Ruth Morgan, Daniel May, and Eve Reeves. So I'm just going to briefly share my screen. I've only got a couple of slides that will hopefully help to. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so here's a screenshot of the working paper on sustainable history that Carla, Ruth, Daniel, Eve, and I developed in sort of late 2019 and 2020 and published online. So this paper talks about, well, it makes a range of key points, and I've got the link there if you'd like to visit the paper later on.
Andrea, sorry, you're in presenter view, so we can't really see the slides on the big screen. Do you want to put it in? Yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
Sorry. Okay. Presenter view. Okay. How do I change that?
I think if you click the swap displays up at the top.
Displays. Aha.
There you go. Thank you. Well, now
Yes.
we can see it better. Thanks.
Okay. So this is building on work by academics and professionals in history. So people like Simon Slate and Toby Green, Celeste Laureau, and also people like Architects Declare and so on. We're not the first people to have reflected on how we in our professional work as academics can try and create change from within and create a more sustainable way of working. The paper goes through a range of individual and institutional responsibilities. So we're not arguing that it's just up to us as individuals in our daily lives, the kinds of choices that we make, to work on creating more sustainable working professional lives, but also to try and push for institutional change. There's certainly a role for individual change and individual decisions and behaviours, but change has to be institutional as well. One of the most controversial aspects of the paper related to travel. We're arguing that although it's true that there is a carbon footprint generated by digital conferencing, online conferencing, and digitisation of records and so on, those methods are lower carbon than flying people around. So we argue that we need to really denaturalize flight, particularly for people in the global north, for equity reasons as well as for carbon reasons. So we outline a range of measures for low carbon conferences, ranging from virtual participation to catering choices, and the issue of food waste, of course, is an important one for carbon minimisation. And one of the really interesting things that we've come across is some research that was done that showed there's no significant relationship between academic travel and research productivity. So the argument, I think, has long been that we need to travel to archives, we need to travel to conferences in order to produce high quality, effective histories and have those disseminated throughout our professional networks. But in fact, this research shows that travel in many ways is a reward for seniority rather than an essential productivity tool. And in a way, I think the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions on travel that has that's created have really borne this out. We've been able, in spite of all of those restrictions, to continue doing really great work and disseminating it, exchanging it through other lower carbon means. So one of the other things that we propose is nurturing local networks and engaging with proximate communities. We, particularly in Australia, but perhaps elsewhere, have a kind of fetishization of the international. You must go out and beyond your local community to be doing great work, but I don't think that's really the case. And now we're very fortunate that we can be internationally connected, as well as deeply locally engaged, and still do really important high quality work in those local contexts and with local colleagues who are working in cognate areas. Justice and equity are also a really important part of the picture here. So if we think about a remaining carbon budget that we have, those who have already benefited most from the existing use of carbon should be those to make the greatest sacrifice now. And it's those who have not had that kind of privilege that should be given the greatest share of the remaining carbon budget. So in the paper, we argue that early career researchers, for example, and that would also, we'd also bring into the fold Indigenous researchers in the Australian context, people of colour, people who haven't had the kind of opportunities that many of the scholars in the global north have had, should be those who are able to benefit most from the remaining carbon budget. Some of the ideas that we didn't really talk about in our paper, but would be great to expand upon at some point, would be opportunities in teaching. How can we try and push for or exemplify low carbon, biodiversity friendly forms of teaching? And also the idea that, in fact, Carla raised in a discussion we had earlier today about embedding sustainability as ethical research in all processes and practices. So, for example, in Australia, if we want to go and do oral history interviews, we need to undertake an ethics approval, which is quite onerous because it's the same kind of form and paperwork that's used for medical research as well. So we have to answer questions about non-ionizing radiation and use of human embryos and so on. And I'm not suggesting that people should have to that there should be a kind of proliferation of paperwork and box ticking, but we need to think hard about how to embed those ethical principles in all of the scholarly activities that we undertake. So whether it's agencies that pay for research and the kinds of research application grant processes associated with that, how can those ensure that the kind of research we're doing acknowledges that we're doing it using the living planet, because there's nothing outside of that. So we're a bit surprised about some of the responses to the working paper. We did get a bit of pushback. There were many people who supported it, and you can still sign on to endorse the paper online. But there were also people who worried about the social and cultural implications of trying to minimize travel, of virtual signaling, people who said, well, travel is recompense for hard work in academia, which was borne out by that research on the benefits, the actual benefits of travel, and people worrying about foregoing their research careers. So this then brought me to think about this concept of fetishistic disavowal, which I've been talking about with a colleague at UWA, Tony Hughes-Daith, who has taken this idea from Zizek, obviously, to try and explain how it is in, capitalist societies, we know that climate change, biodiversity collapse are big problems. We know that they're here now. We know that they will intensify. And we keep talking about them, yet in our daily lives, we act as though we don't know. So it's this paradox of, yes, I know, but I act as though I don't know. And Tony is arguing that this is, well, along with Zizek, that this is something that is used in Western societies or capitalist societies in place of forms of repression, for example, of information that you might see in more authoritarian contexts. So I guess this is one thing that I was thinking about to explain how it is that we get these anxious and sort of dismissive responses when we're calling for real action. And I think these are part of a more general pattern of dissociation. You've got denial on the one hand, but this is a kind of a way of depleting claims for action of their urgency and of their kind of gravity. So, and on top of that, of course, widespread and imminent ecosystem collapse seems improbable from the global north vantage points that many of us occupy. So it's kind of concealed by our distance from shadow places and also the sheen of late capitalism. So I think this is the kind of context in which this fetishistic disavowal flourishes. But what our paper is saying is essentially that historians have roles to play in disrupting this mechanism of disavowal by conducting our professional work as if we know the truth about planetary collapse, by pushing to modify the institutional and social networks within which we operate, and by writing about the past as always a more than human unfolding. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was great and provocative, and has given us a lot to think about. Our next presenter is Dr. J.T. Rohn. He is an assistant professor of African American Studies at the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University, and a 2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Ford Foundation Fellow at the Schomburg Center for the Study of Black Culture and the New York Public Library. He currently serves as the lead of the Black Ecologies Initiative at the Institute for Humanities Research at ASU. His paper is titled Rural Black Social Life in the Chesapeake After the 1933 Hurricane.
Thank you so much. And thank you to my panelists and the organizers of this wonderful conversation and discussion. I want to, and pull the plug on me if I start to go too long, but I want to just give some remarks out of work towards a project that will have a kind of public component in the summer back in my hometown in the Tidewater, Virginia. And part of it draws on, what Justin and I have been working on around, deep mapping Black expressive cultures and the ways that we have to think about those as critical environmental texts because I think, you know, we're at a critical juncture. I think climate change in some ways is a scientific euphemism for slavery, colonialism, genocide, and violence. So it's in that context that I'm writing and thinking, how do we think about Black ways of knowing and being that have already rehearsed and known these histories in the past before the kind of scientific, you know, discussion consolidated around climate change and the Anthropocene. So let me just jump in. In a 1980 recording of work songs from Virginia released as part of the Smithsonian Folkways series, Lena Thompson, Lucy Scott, and Lucy Smith, three crab pickers in Bluff Point, Virginia along the Potomac, sing a song, Sleep On. The central theme of the spiritual's lyrics are death. Sleep on, mother, lay down and get your rest, Thompson calls out, followed with vocal accompaniment from Smith and Scott. As they go through repeated rounds, imploring their mother, father, and others to ease into eternal sleep and rest, the sounds of their labor, the sloshing sound of removing crab meat from shells, forms the ambient backdrop of their vocals. As the liner notes document, the song was recorded at a crab meat production plant that was the last of its kind in the Northern Neck region of Virginia. I could talk about why those scare quotes in a minute. There's a resurgence of industrial fishing in this area. While the blue crab figures centrally in the cultural life of Black communities along the Potomac and in many rural and urban communities, Black communities, beginning under slavery, its location shifted through dislocation and commercialization in the 19th century industrialization of the waterscape. So let me just start by going back to thinking about, with slave narratives, about the place of stuff like the crab and other fisheries in Black tidewater life. James V. Dean, a former slave born on a plantation in Maryland, just near the Potomac and inlet of the Potomac, recalled to an interviewer, "My choice food was the fish and crabs cooked in styles by my mom." Here is significant that his preferred foods were products of the delicate watershed, brackish ecologies that constitute the primary contours of the region, and that it was prepared by his mother. I think when we think about the kind of downloading of responsibility on the slaves for feeding themselves, you know, in this context, Black communities are also doing insurgent work around through those same ecologies and through plotting, as I've written some about, to create intergenerational social life and affection in the face of dominion, starvation, and ecocide. The water served as a kind of Black commons, a furtive and sometimes failed challenge to dominion, and acted in the interstices and edges of plantation society. And of course, during the Civil War, key sites of this kind of geography are destroyed, right? You know, along with the wider infrastructures of plantations, roads, and bridges, especially in Virginia, in the Tidewater, you know, as Du Bois documents in his magisterial 1935 Black Reconstruction. The Potomac and other waterways are weaponized, you know, steam and other, you know, battleships, foreclosing the historical relationships of these sites that former slaves had, and re-territorializing the interstices of the plantations as sites of even more intensive danger and violence. And of course, that's a common, you know, the weaponization of the spaces between plantations it pre-exists Civil War, but Black people's access to the commons grows ever fleeting. And of course, you know, later with Jim Crow and the commercialization of leisure, as well as kind of Black codes and other things that penalize relationships to water and land outside of ownership, and especially ones that are related to the commons. This is particularly pointed in the context of the Chesapeake with the 1880s industrialization of its fisheries, where waterscapes shift from being, again, however, even more fleeting after slavery, of a kind of Black sovereignty and a fugitive Black commons, to spaces from which Black communities were prohibited, or in which they served as fungible bodies in the ongoing extraction work as fishermen, as industrial shuckers, as stevedores in the nascent steamboat infrastructures that served as the region's primary mode of transport and extraction. So of course, in 1930, the Black historian Carter G. Woodson describes this kind of transformation. While there are ongoing large baptisms that he documents in his book, The Rural Negro, that hold on to, in some ways, in ritual life, Black connections to creeks, rivers, ponds, lakes, seashores, and streams. These spaces are increasingly closed out. Black people are increasingly closed out from them. As he writes, they're quote, turned away from the bathing beach, which was once a free-for-all swimming place, not admitted to the private game reserve, which occupied the old fishing and hunting grounds, and prohibited from having, quote, any parties on the placid lake where they once rowed their canoes without fear of disturbance. As Woodson documents it, the discommoning of waterways and the erection of racially exclusive commercialized leisure undermined Black people's abilities to access water and gave powerful significance to Jim Crow's early 20th century consolidation. And just very quickly, I want to highlight a Black cultural producer that is recording in the late 20s, in particular, William Moore, a blues rag guitarist from Tappahannock, Virginia, who records on Paramount Old Country Rock in 28. And he calls out on the song, let's take them for an old country rock, Bear, let's go back down to the river, right? And goes on to kind of continue to reference the river across this kind of divide of urban and rural. I'm interested in this kind of, the work that this kind of recording, and I'm kind of moving quickly so I don't take up too much time, that the kind of recording that this, the kind of work that this kind of recording does in relation to a context of enclosure, right? A longing across these kinds of geographies. And here I'm drawing on Ashante Reese's use of Lorena Munez's productive nostalgia to describe a process in which nostalgia is not just memories or imaginations, but instead calls for the embodiment and enactment of practice across kind of space and time. So, I'm thinking here in the larger work and just in the kind of activist scholarly work about the larger history of Black expressive culture in relation to these environments. And of course, enclosure and the displacement of Black people in relation to land and waterscapes is amplified in the 30s in the Tidewater by the Great Hurricane, right? Which of course transforms the post-1880s riverboat, steamboat infrastructure. The wharves along the Rappahannock and the Potomac and most of the other rivers are destroyed. And it literally paves the way for automobility, right? Which has its own complex relationship with the decline of Chesapeake fisheries and fish species, but also, I wanted to highlight that, one of the most devastated spaces from the 33 hurricane was Buckrow Beach, a relatively elite Black, relatively elite Black town that was, just for leisure, right? A beach town. So the spiritual, which I began, I have 1 minute, 2 minutes. Okay, the spiritual where I began in this context of discommoning, appropriation, extractionism, exploitation, and devastation of human infrastructures in the Tidewater ecotone through commercialization, fallowing, and reinvestment takes on new life. The spiritual served as a living intergenerational archive centering the theme of death. It drives a metaphor equating death with rest in the context of tedious commercialized crab picking. And for me, this draws on a particular local variant of, what Clyde Woods termed the blues epistemology. We could think about it as a blues, a spiritual, or a gospel epistemology, depending on what epoch of Black blues epistemology we're talking. Though perhaps nobody takes these women seriously as environmentalists because of the dynamics of race, gender, class, and region that disqualify Black Southern working class women and people in general from meaningful knowledge, communal analysis about the relationship between their labor exploitation, the proximity of their kin and community to death, and the power of their collective sonic work to for vitality in the face of environmental degradation, exposure, tedium, and poverty is a Black ecology, is a Black environmentalism. That's only about half of the paper, so I would love to talk to you more about this in discussion.
All right, thank you. And we will definitely get a chance to talk some more about that. And thank you for your work on sort of pulling those sources that haven't been considered into the public and reframing them in ways that will inform our discussion. Our next presenter is Dr. Justin Hoseby, who is a cultural anthropologist and Black Studies scholar. His research explores Black social and cultural life in the US Gulf Coast and Mississippi Delta regions. His current ethnographic project utilizes research methods from the digital and spatial humanities to explore and visualize how the privatization of neighborhood schools in low-income and working-class Black communities has fractured, but not broken, Black space and placemaking in post-Katrina New Orleans, Louisiana. His talk today is titled Louisiana, Race, Justice, and the Ecological Legacies of the Plantation Economy.
Thank you so much, Erica. I'm going to share my slides now. Okay, I want to begin with a bit of demographic information about New Orleans to kind of set the scene for where my analysis begins in the story of the city. At the moment, currently, New Orleans population has about 343,000 people within the city itself, 1.2 million people in the metropolitan area of New Orleans. In terms of the racial demographics of the city, 60% of the city is African American, 33% is white, 5.3% is Hispanic or Latino, and 2.9% are Asian. And the per capita household income in New Orleans is $23,000 a year, roughly. So you can see the poverty rate in New Orleans hovers around 20%, and it has remained stable at that rate for the past 20 years. Hurricane Katrina made landfall in New Orleans on August 29, 2005, inundating about 70% of the city. You can see a picture of the storm here. And I'm kind of running through this a bit because I know I have abbreviated time, but I want to really get into the analysis part. So where I enter the scene of New Orleans is really essentially 14 years after Hurricane Katrina. That's when I began doing, that's when I kind of began doing my ethnographic fieldwork in New Orleans. And just to kind of catch up on the population decline of the city that's happened since Katrina happened. African-American population, although it's still the majority population of the city, the population has indeed declined by almost 100,000 people. So you see 95,625 Black people have never come back to the city post-Hurricane Katrina. At the same time as that has happened, home values have increased by 54% in the city, and rents have increased by 50% in the city. New Orleans currently has 47 affordable rentals for every 100 low-income residents. 37% of renters in New Orleans spend half of their monthly income on rent alone, and 36% of renters spend more than half their monthly income on rent. So you can see in New Orleans, there's been a population decline. There's been an attendant kind of inflation of home value and home prices as well, and home affordability as well. And for low-income residents, it's been a really tight crunch on their ability to kind of come back to the city of New Orleans. And in my work, what I'm arguing is that essentially many of the post-Katrina reforms that kind of came into the city to kind of help rebuild the city post-Katrina were kind of structured in a way such that for people who were poor or working class, particularly Black people, it made it that much harder for them to come back into their communities and reconstitute their communities themselves. So I think that one way in which this happened was the destruction of all public housing in New Orleans post-Katrina. After the storm happened, actually, many of the public housing facilities that were in New Orleans were not destroyed by the storm. However, post the storm, essentially, in many ways, they just said, let's just shut down all of the public housing in New Orleans. At the same time we closed all the public housing in New Orleans, they also privatized the school system. So I'm arguing that these two things kind of run in tandem, and these are things that were kind of put in place by post-Katrina policies in order to kind of make sure that for working class and poor Black people, it'd make it that much harder for them to return back to the city post-Katrina. So I entered my fieldwork essentially thinking about what happened in the aftermath of the storm, which was the undemocratic destruction of New Orleans public schools. So as I mentioned before, Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. By September 2005, the Bush administration, George W. Bush, gave the city of New Orleans a $21 million grant from the Department of Education. But what this grant specified was that it would be put towards the rebuilding of schools, but only if those schools were charter schools. This kind of infusion of capital could not be used to actually rehab and rebuild the traditional public schools that were there before. They could only be used to build new charter schools, okay? In November of the same year, after Katrina, and the city is still kind of partially inundated at this point, the Louisiana legislature passed Act 35. And what Act 35 did was it dissolved the teachers union that existed in New Orleans. And also what it did was it converted all of the traditional public schools in New Orleans into essentially charter schools, okay? So these are all public schools, but they're actually managed by charter management organizations and corporate organizations that kind of administer and administer the public schools. At the same time as they did that, in terms of kind of stripping away that public good of public education from the people of New Orleans, 3,000 educators were placed on disaster leave without pay immediately. So people who were still recovering from the storm, who were teachers, administrators, and staff inside of schools, they were put on disaster leave without pay, and then eventually terminated on March 25th, 2006. And in many ways, this decimated New Orleans' middle class, many of whom were teachers and educational professionals, but also working class and lower class people were also impacted as well. So I began my research thinking about essentially, okay, if you have post-Katrina reforms that are happening here, my question was, okay, so how many people actually came back to the city? And look at it on the census tract level by neighborhood. What neighborhoods were kind of, were easier or kind of rebuilt themselves more easily than others? So by mapping out by census tract, this youth loss in the city, to see how many households with children were lost post-Katrina. You can see in this particular map here, in particular areas, particularly the kind of the central city area, which is kind of a low-income working class area of New Orleans, you see massive youth loss happening here. In the lower 9th Ward here, you see similar youth loss here. Also, you see here in the 7th Ward, Gentilly area, where I did my research primarily, lots of youth loss here, and also in the New Orleans East area, lots of youth loss. So I'm thinking about, at the same time, you had this kind of massive restructuring of educational policy and housing policy in New Orleans, many people are not able to come back into their old neighborhoods, okay? And it's almost happening in a systematic way, targeting certain neighborhoods, but you can see certain neighborhoods people haven't really come back to those areas. And it's interesting to see how the same map that shows you where these pockets of kind of youth loss are in the city also correlate alongside, of course, residential segregation in the city. New Orleans really can be considered in many ways an apartheid geography. The racial segregation in New Orleans is very, 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 very extreme. It's been that for most of the city's history. But if you look at this map here, this is a racial dot map. So on a racial dot map, essentially every white household in New Orleans is reflected with a red dot, and every Black household is reflected with the blue dot. So you can see here, of course, massive segregation happening in most of the city. But there's this one tiny crest here called the Sliver by the River. And this is where the French Quarter of New Orleans is about there. So you can see this area here where mostly, you see mostly white households in the Sliver by the River. Okay, this actually geographically and topographically is a natural crest along the Mississippi River, which is of higher ground. So essentially when the storms impact New Orleans, as storm surge and flooding happens, these areas are kind of on a natural levee that kind of protects these homes. And of course, you see in the areas here, the Central City area, you see the Gentilly area, 7th Ward area, where Black people live. These are the areas that are impacted most heavily when storms happen. So you can see here in New Orleans, of course, you may have known this before, but just in terms of where people live in New Orleans, very heavily racialized, but essentially it maps alongside basically flood risk in the city. So in my research, I'm thinking about how schools became converted into charter schools and privatized post-Hurricane Katrina, but also I'm thinking about the ways in which, of course, in many ways, the NOLA recovery efforts were designed to get particularly low-income working class Black people, Black New Orleanians, to rethink their ideas of what the city is, rethink their ideas of what the citizen is, rethink their ideas of the urban. And one way that they did that was, of course, by destroying neighborhood schools in New Orleans. So essentially, the way that charter schools work is that charter schools are open enrollment in New Orleans, which means that you're no longer bound to your particular neighborhood to go to a particular district school. Your parents typically go online to the One App. It's called the One App. It's an online module where parents then rank their top 10 choices of charter schools for each of their children. And then an algorithm places those children into particular schools, oftentimes without respect to where people actually live in the city. So I see the chat, I'm sorry. Am I running out of time? Okay, I'm sorry, running out of time, okay. So you can see the city's being kind of fractured by these processes. And I wanna play this alongside, of course, what's happening in New Orleans vis-a-vis hurricanes and coastal erosion, because of course, what could kind of cause those structural changes in the city was caused by Hurricane Katrina. But also, if you think about the fact that New Orleans is a very vulnerable city, according to FEMA, New Orleans is the most vulnerable American city to hurricanes in the United States, okay? And over the past 100 years, Louisiana has lost 200 square miles of coastline. In many ways, that loss has been due to offshore drilling in the petrochemical industry, canals and channels that were dug throughout the crucial wetlands of southern Louisiana for oil transformation, oil, gas exploration, and gas exploration have led to much of the wetland loss of the city, such that when hurricanes come, the storm surge that would traditionally be kind of, soaked in by the wetlands are being kind of rushed into the city of New Orleans itself. And I want to end just kind of thinking about, of course, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 that happened. And I want to show you all just really incarcerated people were actually tasked with doing that labor. And Louisiana has a very, very large carceral state. And I'll kind of push through quickly now that you can see, but just prior to 2019, Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate of any state in the United States. 70% of the people in those prisons and jails in Louisiana are actually Black. And what's happening here is that you have a history of convict leasing, such that for those people who are Black in those prisons, their labor actually gets contracted out to places like BP, British Petroleum, when these climate catastrophes actually happen. So in my work, I'm really thinking not critically about the intersection between the carceral state, climate change, and also the way that incarcerated people's labor becomes tasked to do that work, and how New Orleans is a primary, or Louisiana itself is a key site to explore those modalities. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. And it draws on some of the things that have happened earlier in the the Climate in Context series that Megan and I have been doing. David Pello gave a talk about environment in the carceral state. So maybe the people who were there can actually draw on that too. And we've seen that was a great way. You've kind of set us up for, Andrea set us up for how we can sort of turn our work internally to see ourselves in the academy, how we critique ourselves. JT's work shows us how our work can sort of be used in the public to rethink things, and yours helps us reframe policies potentially that could be made in the future related to climate issues, or at least that's one of the uses I see for it. Our next speaker is going to pull things to a kind of global scale. And he is Dr. Paul Edwards. He is director of the program on science, technology, and society at Stanford University, and a professor of information and history emeritus at the University of Michigan. He writes and teaches about the history of politics and culture and information infrastructures. Edwards is the author of A Vast Machine, Computer Models, Climate Data, and the Politics of Global Warming, and The Closed World, Computers and the Politics of Discourse in Cold War America, as well as numerous other co-edited volumes and articles. He is currently serving as one of over 900 lead authors on the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to be released in late 2021. His paper today is Writing History into the IPCC's 6th assessment report.
Thank you so much. And I apologize for being a bad citizen at this conference. I'm currently on the first trip I've taken since the pandemic began, touring my son to colleges he's considering. So let's see. I don't have a lot of time. I was brought into the 6th assessment report into Working Group 1, which is the physical science side, because I wrote a book about the history of climate models and climate data. I'm one of the very few social scientists who has ever been in Working Group 1. I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a bit weird because I'm currently in Ann Arbor, which was inhabited by the Potawatomi and other tribes, but in any case, where I normally am was the Ohlones. Let's see, very briefly about this report and what my role in it. So the outlines for IPCC reports are set by the outgoing members of the previous report, and we were handed this outline, this piece up here, synthesis of key findings from the last report and earlier assessments, and framing of the physical science information relevant for many things. Those were the pieces where they felt a historian could be useful. And there was, in the 4th assessment report in 2001, there was a long historical chapter. It was really actually very good. So we got a good bit of pushback about whether we still needed another not 2001, 2007. And in any case, we pushed back on that, and I worked with 14 other chapter authors to develop this chapter. I mainly focused on these pieces of the chapter where we are now, mainly on the policy and governance context and on the scientific context. And the only reason I think it's something interesting to talk about with an audience of historians is that there were a lot of constraints on this process that were really interesting to have to deal with. I mean, it's been 3.5 years in the making, and it comes out at about 40 pages of text altogether. In a normal, if it were a normal journal article. And we're very constrained by the previous reports that carved things up into observations, paleoclimate, natural and human drivers, understanding and attributing climate change, and then models or projections of future climate change. And there were lots of effects that made that process even more constraining. Some of them were that every subdiscipline has its own received history, and people wanted to put that into their section. So every single thing that we cover ends up with 1 or 2 or 3 sentences. So for example, others earlier today were talking about indigenous knowledge that gets less than a paragraph, but that's true of everything. So all pieces of the report are just very tightly constrained, and it is a real challenge to write sentences that are short and dense enough to contain something interesting in that frame. But what do we find? So I can't share detailed findings, but I will share this piece, and I think it is a really important thing. We are moving from the 1990 report that basically said we think it's going to happen, but we can't see the signal in the noise yet, to a moment when we just declare it, debate about it over. So we literally call it an established fact. We've done a number of things in those intervening years that are very important: closing the energy budget for the planet, closing the sea level budget so that we know exactly what contributions are causing what amount and percentage of sea level rise. We have seen that global temperature go up. We have also extended the observational record from about 1,000, less than 2,000 stations used in the 1990 report to upwards of 40,000 stations. And that was done by historical work, in the sense that people went back and found older records that they had to then digitize and adjust to fit the, to kind of be commensurable with the modern record. And then on the much, much longer time scales, these records have extended back much further in time: 65 million years of temperature, 450 million years of carbon dioxide, and an especially important number, the global ocean heat content, which is where most of the heat is going. And at the time of the 1990 report, there were only 2 small regions in the North Atlantic where there was any kind of a lengthy, good quality record. Now that record has been extended 1871 to 2018 as a global record. So a lot of important scientific advances during that period. Now I want to say some things about this as a historian speaking to other historians. One thing I want to know, can you all see the entire slide here? Because mine is covered partly by a bit of Zoom.
Yes, we can see.
Okay.
We can see.
So one of the things about historians and history is that we tend to focus on scales that are relevant to people like us. And those scales are essentially generational in scope. So 20 years, 50 years, a couple of 100 years, usually local to national in scale. And one of the things I've learned from hanging out with climate scientists for a long time, I mean, really the last 25 years of my career has been spent doing that, is to have this much more elastic and much, much longer time frame always in mind. So here the species timescale is 200,000 years. So now we're looking at, in this slide, we're looking at the last 100,000 years. So what that means is that genetically modern humans, the species Homo sapiens, emerged 200,000 years ago. But our civilizations, as we understand it, as most historians study them, are at maximum 10 to 12,000 years old, since the dawn of agricultural civilization and the dawn of writing. So That's just a useful perspective to keep in mind when we talk about climate change. Let's see. And I want to use that moment to jump off. I really liked what JT and Justin just talked about, because you guys were talking about infrastructure in a lot of ways. And that has been a lot of my focus. Much of what I've written about has been knowledge infrastructures, but we also inhabit gigantic technological infrastructures. And in my field, in history of science and technology, one of the big bugaboos has always been technological determinism. We can't talk about technological determinism because people make choices. We decide. It's all about human beings, political conflict, coming out eventually with some form of some result. But I've been very influenced by these Peter Half papers, the citations down there at the bottom, about technology on the geological scale. So he analogizes our technological systems, which include human components. And this is exactly what JT was talking about. So, in the case of the plantation system, enslaved people, but also the owners. So it's a human system, but it's also a technological system. And the thing about technology is that it endures, and it can last for decades, centuries, even longer. Roman roads are still in use. They've been paved, but it's the same road. If we look at the global scale of energy metabolism, we are now approaching the same scale as the biosphere, the entire biosphere. So the biosphere converts about 90 terawatts of energy per year from photosynthesis and turns it into using photosynthesis, turns solar radiation into chemical energy. The technosphere uses up about 10 terawatts of that photosynthetic power through agriculture and forestry, and then another 17 terawatts in fossil and nuclear and renewable energy systems. And the goddamn thing weighs 1.1 trillion tons. It weighs more than the entire biosphere. All life on Earth, the stuff we have made, weighs more than that. So it is colossal. And what does that mean? Well, if you think about this historically, here is a video of the temperature change over the last 140 years, more or less. And I invite you to see this as the breathing of the global technological systems that we created during that period. So they consume oxygen and burn and turn it into carbon dioxide when they burn fossil fuels. And that's how we've ended up with this temperature profile. These global scale technological systems have an ability to resist our intervention that is really remarkable. And so here's the things I want to try to close out with. So if we look at the United States, and we look since 1990, our GDP per capita has been going up, but our carbon output has in fact been going down, even if we take into account the fact that we've offshored a lot of our manufacturing to China, where and other countries where the carbon dioxide used to make those products is produced. So even if we take that into account, we've still seen some decline in the per capita carbon emissions. But that is a slide that begins in 1990. If we look at annual carbon dioxide emissions for the whole world, and we start in 1800, of course, very little being burned, fossil fuel being burned in 1800, and then it begins to take off. And throughout the 20th century, it grows at a colossal rate. And if we look at that in the context of policy about climate change, every president since John Kennedy has been briefed on climate change. The scientific consensus on the extent of climate change has existed since 1979. It has not changed. More and more knowledge, yes, a series of IPCC reports, and yet every year carbon dioxide emissions have gone up. So that technosphere is resisting every attempt to constrain it. We've been successful to a small degree in constraining it in the United States, but then it pops up again elsewhere. And so here we have a graph that goes from 1900. So in this world that I travel in, the climate science world, time is a zoomable entity. It goes from decades to centuries to millennia to multi-millennia to millions to billions of years, and all of it is important. A bit more on the policy side. So global net emissions, we have these nice projected pathways for how we would get to net zero. And of course, here we are in 2021, and we've already missed this 2020 moment when we were supposed to be starting a steep decline of emissions. Let's take a look at that in perspective of the last 200 years of the whole industrial era, okay? Population growth, I'm not trying to draw any direct correspondence here, but population has been rising. It has not peaked yet. It probably will peak out somewhere around 10 billion people by around 2050. Those people all need to burn something at the moment in order to survive. If we look at the path that we are being asked to follow for reducing carbon emissions, and you see it in this global long-term perspective, it looks a lot steeper. Even if we go to 2050 or 2070, that is a very steep path. So we have a lot of change to make, and the change has to be made on an infrastructural level, which means a level that is both extremely expensive and global, and will resist every effort we make to change it. So some of it is being resisted by people, some of it is being resisted simply by the existence of the infrastructures that we all grow up in and take for granted. To us, they're natural background.
Well, thank you. I don't want to cut you off too much, but we're kind of nearing.
Time?
Yeah,
Okay.
You're hitting time.
All right, I will just go to my last slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I did not have the chat up. I'll simply go to my last slide.
No worries.
So we have these kind of category constraints that have limited the way we were able to write history in the sixth assessment report. The purpose of it for me in writing it into that report was to emphasize the deep and long history of climate knowledge, that there have been many cycles of revision and refinement of climate knowledge. For historians, what I wanted to emphasize is this sense of taking both scales of space and time that are larger than the typical historian thinks about and putting them into our agendas as we write. And the other thing is to think about the ways that infrastructure, both physical and human, enable us and also constrain us, that they seek energy and they will keep seeking energy no matter what we do, that they seek maintenance and they have it and they swarm when they're broken, and they will keep trying to grow even as we try to constrain them. So there's this kind of whack-a-mole response to any attempts we make to constrain them, where we set a policy in one place and it's immediately undercut by something else that happens elsewhere. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great and provocative. And as somebody who writes about infrastructure, I'm looking forward to talking with you about that and the rest of the panelists. So our final presenter today, and then we'll move to a larger conversation, is Dr. Dolly Jorgensen, who is a professor of history at the University of Stavanger in Norway, specializing in histories of environment and technology. Her current research agenda focuses on cultural histories of animal extinction, and she recently published Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, Histories of Longing and Belonging, with MIT Press. She is the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Environmental Humanities and co-directs the Greenhouse Environmental Humanities program area at her university. Her paper is Isn't All Environmental Humanities in Practice? So she's posing a question and is going to reflect on that. So welcome, Dolly.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this panel. So my reflections are a bit different. They're coming from my work as a co-editor of the journal, because in January 2020, I and Franklin Jen from the University of Bristol in the UK took over the editorial duties of the journal Environmental Humanities. So the journal is the publication of record, I would say, in the burgeoning fields, constellation, agenda, depending what you want to call it, of environmental humanities, which engages with the fundamental questions of meaning, value, responsibility, and purpose in a time of rapid and escalating change. And we've heard from other panelists about what those escalating changes are. We, Franklin and I, have interpreted the journal's mission as the publication of scholarship on environment that draws humanities and the qualitative social science disciplines in conversation with each other without being programmatic or dogmatic. So it's a wide and flexible field, and history is certainly part of that. And I would note that Andrea Gaynor, who spoke with you first in this panel, is actually one of our associate editors. One of the things we decided early on was that we wanted to seek to broaden the geography of the journal's authorial voices, readership, and empirical foci in an attempt to do justice to the multiplicity of environmental cultures. So early in the spring of 2020, I had some conversations with Bethany Wiggin from the University of Pennsylvania, who will be talking actually in the next panel. And in that discussion, we discussed how the journal might be able to support scholarship on community environmental engagement projects. So as founding director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, Bethany has cultivated a strong program of public engagement. I know you'll be excited to hear about that. And it includes community-based data collection projects, artistic interventions, and public climate storytelling. Now, many of these projects involve early career researchers, PhD students, younger scholars who spend their time and their energy cultivating community connection and on-the-ground programming. So the kind of things we've heard about from the earlier speakers as well. So could there be more support for publishing peer-reviewed scholarship on these kinds of projects and interventions, was the question that we discussed. Now, the challenge of answering that question, part of it had to do with peer-reviewed publication forms. So environmental humanities research articles have a kind of standard maximum word count, 9,000 words, most run at least 7,000. They have about 5 images at max. They're typically analytically rich, and they're contributing to some kind of theoretical development of the field. There's a particular format, language, and the type of arguments made in our articles that might not be the right kind of article. It might create a barrier for community engagement with the publication, because as much as we like to say that we write as academics for some wide public, many times actually, if you look at the kinds of words and form that we use, it's not for publics, it really is for each other. So probably all of us on this call are fine, but maybe not your informants. And so was what we already had the right format for public intervention projects? So the second challenge in thinking about this was, well, how to actively cultivate scholarship of this type. So Bethany's query had been on community-facing work, but we also wondered about things like pedagogy and where teaching comes into play in this discussion. Where do they fit in the journal? Now, the journal had just recently published a review of environmental humanities teaching. So it isn't like the journal wasn't dealing with it. It did have one, but it had never published an environmental pedagogy article. So how we actually teach in the classroom beyond this one review. Despite, in fact, a quite early on article in the journal's history by Rich Hutchings that had asked for critical pedagogy as one of the things for our field to do. So was it simply enough to say, well, if we get an article of this type, we're of course going to send it out to review and we might publish it? Or did we need to call it out as a specific kind of scholarship that people need to do. So we discussed the pros and cons of publishing articles on what we call public environmental humanities work within our existing structure. But we decided we would make a new article form, and we established this environmental humanities in practice that was referenced in my title to fill this, what we felt was a gap. So these are slightly shorter articles in design. They are peer reviewed. They offer space for critical reflection on artistic, civic, pedagogical, and policy-based projects. So I would just say, JT and Justin, send us stuff about this kind of work that's actually critically engaging people on the ground. We wanted to acknowledge, present, and discuss the intellectual and practical engagements with the journal's interests beyond the narrowly conceived academy. And therefore, we specifically stress that this needs to be highly accessible language. Now, we recognize there's a risk in setting up such a category. We know that the history of the fields that make up environmental humanities, so environmental history and eco-criticism, are deeply activist and interventionist by nature, as many of you will know. So most people come to the environmental humanities with an understanding of an ethical obligation in more than human relations and a desire to cultivate change in society. So are we saying, by setting this up, that some environmental humanities are or should be more public facing than others? Are we calling out that by saying these should be written in highly accessible language, that somehow others shouldn't be? So we understand this as an issue, but we felt it was worth to call out artistic, civic, pedagogical, and policy practices as publication topics that environmental humanities wants to actively publish. We have had submissions of this type. It was only launched a year ago, so it takes some time for people to start to submit. But we do have one that'll be coming out next year that was co-authored by 2 professors and an undergraduate student, talking about pedagogy in that case. So perhaps the time will come when we'll delete this new article category, because public facing work is so integrated into our regular articles that it doesn't make sense anymore. And perhaps then all environmental humanities will be environmental humanities in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolly. While the panelists are having a roundtable discussion, and I've got a couple of questions to start that off, if you have a question for them, go ahead and put it in question and answer, or raise your hand and we will move you so you can ask your question live to the panelists. And again, that gives a little bit more of a human quality to the discussion. But if you're not comfortable for that, or you can't or you can't do it, Megan and I will moderate questions in the Q&A session. So my first question for all the panelists is, I'm hoping for the attendees, you can all reflect a little bit on your own journey into what might be called activism. That's not exactly the right term, but the kind of ethical obligation that Dolly was talking about. So, what inspires you? And then to also just be perfectly honest about this, for attendees, graduate students, et cetera, have you faced any kind of pushback from your institution or from others in the profession who feel like it's kind of stepping beyond the realm of academia to do the kinds of work that you all are doing? So we might just have to sort of unmute ourselves and try to have a conversation like we would, maybe signal somehow, raise your hand if you have something to say, so I can. Dolly, since
yeah, I mean, I guess, so one of the things about this kind of pushback, or the institutionalization of these kind of things, is that, working in a journal and for a journal and Andrea and can attest this as well. You know, it's free labor, right? We're donating our time and our labor, even as co-editors of the journal. There's no financial or other like thing you get back that somehow decreases what I do every day in my academic job. So, you know, you can think about whether or not that's a good system and how that functions. But it is part of the labor of activism. Then, I mean, I believe we also have to recognize that the labor that we do to support the field of environmental history. You know, I am an environmental historian myself, even though I was talking about a journal, it's environmental humanities. The work that we do to support scholarship, the work that we do to mentor young people, is all part of our activist work. And that's not always compensated or seen institutionally as something that's important. And yet I feel it's incredibly important. And it's the most, it can be extremely rewarding when, you know, I worked last year with somebody who was a young woman scholar who's, you know, was looking for permanent employment. And we put together a grant application and she didn't get it. And we were really disappointed, but, you know, we'd start again. And I felt this really strong mentorship because she's doing good work about migration and environmental concerns and causes. And, you know, she just landed a actual job. And, you know, I was so happy. I mean, this is exactly what we have to do, right? As a scholar activist.
Thank you. Justin, do you want to address that a little bit, or JT?
I think for me, you know, my research is really animated by my life experience as a Black person, honestly. And I think that's what really frames my political commitments and my intellectual commitments as well. And I think for me, being a Black studies scholar, that means that, you know, it's important for me to always think about the ways in which my work is inherently political and think about the political uses of what that work actually is. And not only that, to ensure, you know, to work alongside people, you know, in the struggle, because, you know, this is you know, as JT's work has pointed out, and so much important work on thinking about reconceptualizing the idea of the Anthropocene. You know, we're living through the euphemism, as JT described it, of, you know, climate change. And really, we're living in the legacy of what, you know, I've seen historian Robin Kelly describe as a 500-year crime wave, which is colonialism and imperialism. I think that, you know, it's important for me to think about this because I think that oftentimes our liberal institutions structure this crime and these atrocities against the planet and against people as just the cost of doing business, such that we accept them and they're in the background of our lives. And for me, for example, I'm connecting in my research the privatization of schools in New Orleans to the carceral state, because I'm saying that, you know, the anti-Black logics that devalue Black life also structure the political economy of Louisiana. And what happens in the sense is that essentially Black people become, in Black communities and in Black and Indigenous communities as well in Louisiana, become the prime territory for, you know, all kinds of modes of extraction, all kinds of modes of kind of, you know, you have in Southern Louisiana a term called Cancer Alley, which really thinks about the way that across so much Southern Louisiana, you have so many, you know, chemical plants, and petrochemical industry is so tight and it's so firmly entrenched there, such that people who live in those communities, largely Black communities, they suffer, you know, extreme rates of cancer, extreme rates of, so for me, you know, the activism really comes out of an internal well within me to really outline the ways and archive the state violence that's happening as I see it. Because I think that these are all, you know, forms of state violence. And I think that's why what JT said was so powerful to me earlier, because I think that, you know, there's a documentary, I'm not sure if you all have seen it, it's on HBO Max by Raoul Peck. It just came out recently. And it's called Exterminate All the Brutes. And I would encourage you to check that out, because I think that, you know, in doing my own research and thinking about the climate disaster and thinking about the fact that, as you pointed out, Paul, institutionally, we've known this since the 70s, what's happening. And there's been no really will on a kind of state level to fix it. And I think that if you really look at the history of European settler colonialism across the world, the drive is genocide of non-white people. And I think that we're seeing a protracted genocide in my country of America, in particular, of non-white people. We've seen that with indigenous folks in America. And I think that it's hard to tell, because I think that we see genocide in terms of like, seminal moments in our history where we're seeing like these kind of intense time collapse events of massive genocide. I think the idea of a genocidal assemblage or a protracted genocide is something that we need to really be thinking about, because I think that the documentary, I would encourage people to check it out, because it really reshaped the way I think about my work, because I think that I've been reading so much of what's happening as kind of racial, anti-Blackness and racial discrimination, of course, kind of predisposure of people who are marginalized already to environmental toxins. But I'm saying that, no, that's not just a byproduct of, that's actually the drive. And it's a genocidal drive at its core. And I think that it's important to name that, outline that, and mark that, and mark our complicity within those structures as well.
Can I just jump in on just to respond to that, Justin? That's a great thought. And I just want to put out a speculation. It's not actually a proven result. Okay, so I want to emphasize that. But there's this phenomenon in the Little Ice Age, when the global temperature dropped a few degrees, well, not a few degrees, but a little bit, back in the 16th and 17th centuries. And one speculation about the reason for that is that when Europeans came to the Americas, about 90 to 95% of the indigenous population died from the diseases they brought. And those populations had previously been burning lots of land to clear it, to hunt, other reasons, agriculture. And when they were burned, they released carbon into the atmosphere and kept the planet a little bit warmer. So when they died out, the carbon dioxide concentrations went down because there was less burning, and then eventually rose again because the populations recovered. So genocide can really actually be detected in the climate record.
Great. I don't know if anybody else wants to reflect on that. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A that we could move on to if.
I wouldn't mind saying something about this. I think for me, the journey to activism and organizing and in conjunction with the scholarship very much resembles what Justin described as being generated out of a desire to see Black communities not only be well, but thrive, and the long process of coming to understand that as something that is impossible within the current conditions of political economy, social reproduction, and also really intimate histories of family and community in which survival and that kind of well-being have been the center. And understanding that and trying to figure out how do we, as we've sort of replayed, I guess, several times already in this discussion, there aren't many people on the planet except people in deep and I would say very troubling, obviously, denial, that don't understand that the environmental crisis that's before us to some degree. And of course, as Justin mentioned, and others have said, it's, that doesn't move anybody, right? That hasn't changed anything. And I think part of that is, of course, a reflection of the intransience of the kind of what Justin just termed the genocidal assemblages, right? This kind of Malthusian and also a kind of genocidal relationship with the planet of constant growth that views any other species formation or life as hindrances rather than as critical parts of that wider dynamic and biosphere, including people's cultivations and possibilities for, for sustenance and for maintaining not only human, but also more than human life.
Thank you, JT. Andrea, do you want to say something? Just so everybody.
Yeah, sure. Just briefly. I think that I feel that my path to activism in this area has come out of a sense of there being no alternative, really. The more you speak to people, the more you read, the more you know, the less possible it is to live with yourself if you don't, attempt to address these things in some way. And the idea that, I'm a settler Australian, I'm white, I'm privileged, I've got this platform, and I think there's a moral obligation for me to use it. So essentially that's where I've come from. Do we get pushback from colleagues and others? Well, I showed in my presentation that we've had pushback in relation to our from historians, from other people who you would expect would be similarly educated and motivated, yet haven't quite grasped, I think, the seriousness of our situation, or are not yet prepared to give up their privileges. So, yeah.
That's an interesting point. All of you have made such interesting points, and maybe we can circle back to it at the end, which is how in some ways this is becoming external service work. That's a kind of point that Dolly made, where, it's sort of seen as something morally imperative to us, but institutionally, how our institutions value it is something different. All right, we have a question from Max Conley that I'm going to read for Justin and JT. In your article from 2019, Justin and JT wrote that the idea of Black ecologies, quote, seeks to bring into focus the critical ways that forces above event the hand of the man punctuate, underline, and exacerbate raw spatial inequality. Given this framing, how can we frame the ideas that Paul has brought forward about the technosphere, technological lock-in, momentum, and infrastructure that recognize, as you put it, JT, how climate change is a euphemism for the history of colonialism and racial capitalism?
I think that's a better question for Paul, I think, to kind of take a stab first, because I think he understands the scientific part of it more than I do.
Gosh, well, I don't know if I have a great answer to that question. I'm
wondering if there's not an answer to that question in one of the previous panels, and even Bathsheba DeMuth's talk about narratives. So Andrew Curley in this morning's panel actually suggested that we reframe and sort of move away from the Capitalocene, the Anthropocene, et cetera, because they privilege certain narratives above others. And in that privileging of narratives, potentially alternative paths to understanding both the past and our current climate crisis and future ways forward are foreclosed. And I'm wondering if that might be a way that we could begin to think through an answer.
I think we need strategic, I don't, by calling that a euphemism, I'm not trying to say that we do need strategic formations and understandings and insurgent ones to help us make sense of the reality of these histories. I think part of my pushback against, I guess, the kind of extrapolation out to larger timescales, Paul, and I'd love to hear you talk more about this, is the ongoing erasure of the very kind of structures that we can follow that you just said are documented in tree rings and other geological ice and other geological sources. How do we, and I think we, we can't flatten any of that. If we think that the only spaces in this, in the in the era of globalization after 1492 that have remained like, relatively sustainable are maroon ecologies, are spaces and sites across Indigenous and Black territories that remained in Indigenous and Black territorial sovereignty. I think we have to court that, and I think it's difficult because I think if we think that in some ways that policy or that the state will save us in any meaningful way, Katrina and what Justin's work is pointing out shows that that's absolutely not the case, right? And I think we're on a green fascist horizon that gives me serious pause, right? We're running headlong into the replacement of carbon with lithium. We've seen already that the violence that's tied to. We're talking coups, Bolivia, we nickel and silicone and other stuff replacing carbon is not a viable future. So we actually have to think about decolonization. The only histories of decolonization, successful decolonization, and all of that we have are Black and Indigenous histories, right? So I don't see the kind of flattening of the Anthropocene or any of that as the way forward. But I do see the possibility of use for stuff like racial capitalism, things that bring out the gendered nature of it. I think that's important. Black ecofeminisms and ecofeminisms in general have something to say about this. I think we need insurgent discourses that only really emerged out of the humanities, and not just that, literature and cultural, Black cultural production and other people's cultural production to survive. I think that point about the techno mass versus the biomass. I'm riffing on Kali Akuna, who did our Black Ecology series that we co-coordinate. Justin and I co-coordinate at IHR at ASU, and I think he made the same point in an interview with me and Wendy Marshall, and he said straight up, that's an inorganic system that can only die, and it's not there's no cycle built into the techno sphere. It's only disposability, extraction, construction, and disposability. Yep. And I think that's where we're at, right, for me.
That was brilliant. Thank you for saying that. And my thoughts about all this are mainly that there's no one discourse or solution that's gonna be that masters everything. And a lot of what we've learned from the last 30 years in that history of the IPCC and the fact that the carbon emissions keep going up is that they went into that process kind of thinking that they would soon get a global agreement with some kind of top-down mastery of the whole situation and somehow enforce it. And that wasn't going to happen then, and it's certainly not going to happen now. So what are we left with? Well, we're left, one way I put it is there's no silver bullet. There's silver buckshot. There's a lot of small scale, local, regional, discipline specific solutions and discourses and ways of thinking about these problems that can all play a part in getting somewhere with it. But the constraint of that gigantic system that it just kind of keeps on going no matter what we do, I just think we really have to face up to that. It's not it has gone beyond our control at any scale that we have much agency. So what do we have left? We have local agency. We have groups, individuals, national governments, state governments, cities, everything else. And yeah, I'll stop there.
I mean, I would just come in here, and I think one of the things that goes on and that we saw in the last panel of speakers is about this gospel of efficiency, whether that's capitalist or communist, doesn't matter at all. And that is why we're in the trouble we are, because the systems, in fact, are doing precisely what they're built to do, which is to become more and more efficient. And we are becoming more and more efficient at burning carbon. So that, it really takes a new way of thinking. And what we realize, and like in Bathsheba's talk yesterday, it's not within that system that people have a different relationship to the land. It is getting outside of those efficiency thinking.
Great. The next question we're going to go to is from Adam Clulo. And Adam, I'm going to promote you so you can.
I just did.
Oh, okay. Megan already did that. So you can ask your question.
Fantastic. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. I had a question
Yes.
for Andrea Gaynor. Thank you for a really fascinating paper. I'm just wondering about the role of funding bodies like the Australian Research Council in making concrete change. So it seems to me that these funding bodies at the moment really encourage research with a huge carbon footprint by allocating significant amounts of research, often the bulk of an award, to international travel. And that's, I found, definitely the case with the Australian Research Council, that is assuming that you're going to travel internationally 3, 4, 5, 6 times. It seems if we change this model, it would have a huge impact. And so I'm just wondering if we as academics should put pressure on these funding bodies, often these hugely important funding bodies, to change their basic model of what constitutes good or important research.
Absolutely, absolutely, Adam. And I'm thinking here about what Paul just said about silver buckshot and the technosphere and so on. And I'm thinking that we're only little, but we can nibble at the parts that are closest to us, and that's perhaps one way of having some kind of specific or measurable effect. I mean, I think people are probably reluctant to lobby the ARC in case they get put on some kind of blacklist for being troublemakers. But I think that it's necessary that we start to think or require some kind of attention to these issues when applying for grants. Because, yeah, you're absolutely right. As I said, in Australia, it's regarded as odd if you're not planning on going overseas or doing a lot of flying. That's how you show that you are internationally networked, and international networks are really what make for academic excellence. That's essentially the discourse in Australia. So I think that we need to change that mindset, and absolutely by changing it within major funding bodies like the ARC or NHMRC for other disciplines, then that would really start to get people's attention.
Great. We have one final question that we'll close out on. And before we do that, it was from Bethany Wiggin, who, Bethany, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. We can promote you so you can ask it. But before she says her comment, I just want to remind all the panelists to stay on just for a minute at the end after we close out the session. And if you have the time, so Courtney can change your status so you can join the rest of the conference. And if you have the time, join us for the working lunch right after this, just so we can have a brief conversation about how we might move forward and create something actionable out of this conversation that we're having. So Bethany, do you want to go ahead and ask your question or say your comment? I don't know if she's still here. Actually, she may have left. Megan, do you want to add anything before we close out for the day?
Shall I, are you asking me to read her question or?
Oh, yeah, I can read her question.
Okay.
I think yeah. Do you want to read her question?
She is still here, but hasn't said she wants to speak it.
Okay.
So I can. Okay. It's more of a comment than a question. And I also touch on this point in her talk later this afternoon, but she wanted to point to the activist work that many Black and Indigenous scholars have been doing for decades. I've learned tremendously from this tradition, named by Rupika Risam as insurgent intellectuals. I think this is drawing on things that were earlier discussed as well. But her forthcoming book, she writes, but far from being new, academic insurgency, I suggest, is connected to a lineage that begins with professors' protest literature in the late 19th and early 20th century, continues with the academic trajectories of a range of post-colonial US ethnic and African diaspora intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, Audre Lorde, Sylvia Whitner, bell hooks, and others throughout the 20th century, and is connected to movements in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to establish Black and ethnic studies departments, as well as the emergence of third world and post-colonial feminisms in the 1980s and 90s. I don't know if folks want to respond. She's reiterating in some way some of the points that you guys made, actually, but I'll back off now.
That's so essential. Black folks and Indigenous folks have writers that have been responding to this. And every time I wanted to say this during my talk and I didn't. Every time we talk about Black expressive culture, we also need to realize that there are a whole bunch of ignored formal intellectuals that said very similar things, drawing on Black everyday knowledges, right? Du Bois, I think there's so many. So I underscoring what Bethany said, there's a rich tradition that people who are serious about environmental humanities, I think, collectively need to engage in learning from, right, and understanding. And that's different from co-optation and adaptation and abstraction from one or two Black thinkers, but actually, what does it mean to put at the center of all environmental humanities coursework people like June Jordan, or we could go diasporically or Zora Neale Hurston, or we can go diasporically as well.
That was a really great point, JT, and that's exactly where I would go in making comments, is that part of what historians need to do, and why I decided that it was worth taking up environmental humanities as a journal, is you've got to look beyond just historical, the historical canon as it's been established within the field of history, and that means thinking more widely, and often it means thinking across into people who aren't considered historians, and are coming from other fields like literature and philosophy and urban engagements, and that those things are things we should be drawing on into our history work.
Yeah, I would just earlier this morning at the beginning of the day, we had a talk from a geologist who called himself an earth historian. And that has really been my experience of a lot of the climate scientists I've worked with. There's a category of people who work on, collecting old data and figuring out how it was made and how to adjust it for the present. And of course, all the geological history that they uncover. And they use a lot, especially for the more recent stuff that involves instrument records, so created by people, a whole knowledge infrastructure for knowing about the climate. It involves them in exactly the same kind of work that historians do. They go to archives, they study records, they try to get people to digitize old records so they can put them into modern databases and so on.
Thank you. That's, I think, a fantastic segue both into our next panel, which will be this afternoon for the attendees at 2:30. The panelists, if you can join us for our working lunch, please do so. We realize that there are time differences that might make that difficult, but we hope you can come for just a little while. And we want to thank everyone. I'm sorry you're not here in person for a round of applause, because that was a fantastic discussion, but we want to thank all of you for participating in this roundtable.
It was absolutely amazing conversation, and I so wish we could be having coffee and lunch afterward, more in a more natural setting, but hopefully we can see each other throughout the rest of the conference and at this working lunch for those who are on the program. Thank you so much.